170. The train rolled to a stop at the spot where the trestle had been destroyed. Lieutenant Saunders was there with a truck to transport the new troops that were being delivered to the region to assist with the track work and the trestle repair. Even though the Board of Governors had just voted this past week to reduce military involvement in the region, the number of troops was still rising every week. In fact, the recommendation by the board in favor of troop reduction had never been delivered to Central Command. Major Stillman had seen to that. A loud, brash sergeant summoned the new troops as they disembarked the train and ordered them to stow their gear and themselves in the rear of the truck. When Captain Crawford stepped off the train, he looked around and wondered what on earth he had done wrong to warrant being exiled to such a place. He took a seat in the front of the truck and just nodded as Lieutenant Saunders saluted and introduced himself. Captain Nunez and two agents from Section 7 sat on a ridge not far from the site and observed covertly the passengers as they got off the train. One of the agents tapped Nunez on the arm and pointed to the truck. "I see him," responded Nunez. He was referencing Captain Crawford. Nunez did see him, and countless others like him in his time. He could tell by his swagger and his demeanor that he thought himself to be very special. Nunez thought it odd that they added another layer of command at this point in the operation. He made note of it and moved on. He then watched Lieutenant Saunders as he addressed the new troops. He seemed to have a renewed purpose. Nunez just smiled as he thought to himself, "Go get him, LT." Carl Fairley sat in the interrogation room observing Lee. He was hidden behind the one-way mirror. All the evidence he had gathered on him was just circumstantial at best. Most of it wasn't even evidence at all. He glanced at his watch and then walked into his office and opened the closet that housed the safe that contained the radio he used to contact Section 7. He closed the door and checked all the security protocols before retrieving the radio from the safe. He made contact with the control division of Section 7. He inquired about the clarification of the timelines he had requested for the exit of the group that had looted the small town of Gilberton, some 30 miles away. They confirmed what Carl already knew. The group that looted and burned the buildings in Gilberton did in fact leave several weeks ago, which meant he now had proof that Lee was lying about his timeline. Carl considered his next move carefully. He got up and went into the cell area and stood in front of Lee's cell. The second Lee made eye contact with Carl, he knew it wasn't good. He said nothing as Carl stood before him, staring at him. Carl spoke first. "I know you're lying about when and why you were in Gilberton, and when you left. Fled, as you put it." He waited for a response, but received none. "Now I want the truth. Were you part of the group that created the recent chaos there? Are you affiliated with that motorcycle club that was caught up in the drug turf war there last month?" Lee said nothing and showed no emotion as he listened to Carl. How could he know all this? How could he possibly have ascertained this information so quickly? Still, he said nothing. Carl turned and started for the door as if he were leaving. Then he turned abruptly and said, "Do me a favor, take off your shirt." Lee paused for a moment and spoke for the first time. "A favor? I don't feel the obligation to do you any favors, Constable." Said Carl. "You don't even know what the favor is. Don't you want to help me clear this all up so that you can prove your innocence and get out of here?" The two stood looking at each other. Lee walked over and sat on the bare steel bunk attached to the wall in his cell. "I want a lawyer," he demanded. "A lawyer?" Carl asked. "What do you need a lawyer for?" "I'm not saying another word or granting any favors until I see a lawyer first," Lee asserted. "Well, that could be a problem. There aren't any lawyers in this town. Hasn't been since the EMP attack 6 months ago. It's a simple request. Take your shirt off, and once I see that you don't have any tattoos that connect you to a certain biker club, then you'll be free to go. You can be out of here in less than an hour. Isn't that what you want? Unless you're hiding something. Lee walked over to the cell door and stood less than 3 feet away from Carl. He looked directly at him and said, "Everybody has something to hide, Constable. Even you, I'll bet." He managed a smirk in an attempt to be aloof. He walked back over and sat down again on the bunk. "Lawyer," he said, as he closed his eyes and tilted his head back against the wall. Lieutenant Saunders led Captain Crawford into the Major's office and introduced him to Major Stillman. Stillman looked him up and down and then looked over at Lieutenant Saunders and dismissed him. He picked up a file on his desk and started to thumb through it. "Top of your class at VMI, very impressive." He flipped a page and read some more. "A couple pretty sweet assignments." He flipped another page, then another, "until there's a gap of a few years between your last assignment and now," he said. Crawford responded, "Yes, sir. My last assignment was classified, sir." Stillman flipped back to the first page. He read the bio on Crawford. Born and raised in an affluent suburb of Savannah, Georgia. Private schools. He was starting to form the picture. This was just the sort of officer Congressman Holmes recruited for his private army. The same private army that Major Stillman enjoyed a command position in himself. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Crawford. Yes, he thought, this man had Holmes's fingerprints all over him. He closed the file and dropped it on the desk. "That's all, Captain. You're dismissed. The lieutenant will show you to your quarters." Crawford saluted and replied, "Thank you, sir." Major Stillman just waved him off and sat back down at his desk. "Shut the door on your way out," he demanded. Stillman sat back in his chair and considered all the reasons he could think of as to why Congressman Holmes would send Captain Crawford without informing him. None of them added up to anything good for the Major. Then he considered the possibility that he was wrong about Crawford, that he wasn't part of Congressman Holmes's contingent. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Edwin Nunez walked into Carl's office with 2 coffees from the diner. He sat opposite him at the desk and slid one over to him. "Making any headway with the prisoner?" he asked him. "A little," Carl answered. "He isn't talking, and he's demanding a lawyer, but I do know that he's lying about certain details." "That's something, I suppose." "He's hiding something." Nunez snickered and added, "Aren't we all, brother?" Carl looked up at his friend, puzzled. "That's funny," said Carl. "He said the exact same thing to me before." "It's like he knows you, eh, Carl?" Carl looked up at Captain Nunez. "Did you come in for a reason?" he asked. "Sorry, brother. Didn't mean to hit a nerve." "Maybe I can help you with him. I can go in and pretend to be a lawyer and get him to talk to me." "No, that won't work. For one, I told him there were no lawyers in town. Secondly, if I ever want to bring him before a judge, I gotta do things by the book." "Well," said Nunez, "there is another way. I could go in as a prisoner and start a fight with him. In the scuffle, who knows, maybe his shirt will get ripped off." "I don't know. That's easily thrown out by most judges," said Carl. "I'll stick to by the book for a little bit longer." Nunez nodded and got up to leave. Carl called out to him, "Hey, bro, thanks for offering. It may come to that at some point." He smirked. "Ah, you'll figure it out, my friend. Just keep at him. He'll break." "I don't know about that. He's a tough one." Nunez smiled and walked out onto the platform. He looked inside at his friend sitting at his desk. He walked into the alley, out of sight. He slid down along the building and sat on a wooden crate in the shadows, watching the platform. About a half an hour later, he watched as Carl locked the door behind him and got on his horse, headed out of town towards home. Captain Edwin Nunez stood up and walked toward the street and the train platform. He pulled the brim of his cap down as far as he could without blocking his vision. Once again he had become the gray man. He walked up to the door to the space that housed Carl's office and the jail behind it. After scanning around quickly to make certain nobody was watching, he stuck his knife in between the jamb and the lock and worked the spring-loaded bolt back until he could freely push the door open. Within 45 seconds, he was inside the corridor that led to Carl's office. Again, he worked the knife into place on Carl's door and quickly gained access to his office. Once back in the cell area, Captain Nunez walked over to Lee's cell and stood looking in at him. Lee was sleeping, and Nunez kicked the cell door, causing a clang which woke him up. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked Nunez. "No time to explain. I'm here to get you out. There's someone who wants to meet you." Lee did not want to go with him, but he saw his one and probably only chance to get away from this place. He hoped that once outside he could seize his opportunity. Nunez told him to turn his back and put his arms behind him over by the cell door. When he did, Nunez zip-tied his wrists together and then used the key from the hook on the side of Carl's desk to open the cell door. He led Lee out through a window into the alley behind. This was not the first time that Lee had made his exit from this particular window. Once outside in the alley, Nunez led Lee up to the ridge in the woods and back, to the very spot where he and Buddy Tanner had watched the town from days earlier. There he had an old truck and he placed Lee in the passenger seat. "Who's this person that wants to meet me?" Lee asked. "You'll see when we get there," responded Nunez. Lee had hoped to be able to make a break for it, but his hands were tied behind him and his seatbelt was fastened and pulled tight. He wasn't going anywhere. It was looking as if he would actually meet this mystery man after all. When Nunez pulled the old truck up to the spot where the train trestle was blown up, he stopped. He pulled Lee out and told him to walk over to the spot where the tracks ended. There was nobody else there, and this concerned Lee, who questioned Nunez about it. Nunez told him that they would be here shortly and that they would just wait. Lee started to say something else, and Nunez pulled out his .45 and smashed the butt against the side of Lee's head. He fell unconscious to the ground. Captain Nunez dragged Lee over to where the twisted train wreckage jutted out over the cliff and slid him over. After several seconds, he heard Lee's body splash into the river some 100 feet below. Nunez got in the truck that he stole from a nearby farm earlier and drove away. He reached a pull-off spot on the road just outside of town and coasted the truck to a stop there. He took a gas can from the back and drenched the truck interior with its contents. He stripped off his clothes and threw them into the truck as well. He lit a match and flicked it inside the truck. He was certain that the fireball that rose violently from the vehicle would easily be seen from town. He walked off into the woods and retrieved the backpack he had waiting there. Inside, he removed a change of clothes and got dressed. He walked off again into the woods and didn't look back.